What would you do if your child told you someone visits them every night? A stranger standing in the dark, watching silently. For weeks, a young boy cried out for help, and his mother thought it was just his imagination. But one night, the truth was revealed. A chilling discovery so terrifying it forced her to call 911. Stay tuned as we uncover the horrifying events that turned their dream home into a nightmare, and the shocking twist no one saw coming. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. Ben had always been a sensitive child, perceptive to things others often overlooked. It wasn't that he had an overactive imagination. No, Ben's fears weren't just dreams or stories spun from boredom. But his mother, Yvonne, was determined to give him a fresh start, one where there were no ghosts of the past, no lingering reminders of old struggles. It had been a tough year, losses, uncertainty, and a broken marriage that left her feeling like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Moving into a new home in a quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be the escape they both needed. New beginning, she'd told herself as she packed the last box into the moving truck. She could almost taste the hope in the air. This was it, a fresh chapter, a safe haven for her and her son, far from the chaos they left behind. The house, though modest, seemed like a perfect fit for them. It had that homely charm. White picket fence, a spacious yard with tall oak trees lining the driveway, a porch swing that beckoned on warm evenings. For the first time in months, Yvonne allowed herself to smile. But Ben wasn't so sure. From the moment they arrived, he seemed distant, as if the weight of the house had settled on his small shoulders. He wandered through the rooms, his eyes wide, as if trying to place something he couldn't quite articulate. "Ben?" Yvonne called as she watched him linger in the corner of the living room, staring at the old wallpaper as if it held secrets. "Mm-hmm," Ben murmured, but his gaze didn't waver. "You okay?" Yvonne asked, her voice warm, trying to mask the exhaustion that clung to her. "I feel, watched," Ben said, his words slow, as though testing them. He looked at his mother, a frown on his face. "There's someone here, watching me." Yvonne chuckled, a light laugh escaping her lips. "It's just your imagination, baby. We're in a new place. It'll take time to get used to." But Ben didn't smile. He didn't look reassured. Instead, he dropped his gaze, his small body tense. Yvonne saw the uncertainty in his eyes but brushed it off. A little unease, she thought. It was nothing to worry about. That evening, as they unpacked boxes and tried to settle in, Yvonne felt a strange, creeping sense of discomfort she couldn't quite shake. It was subtle, but the house, something about it didn't sit right with her. The air felt too still, the silence too thick. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, and the neighbors, well, they were friendly enough but had an odd, stifled quality. There were no dogs barking, no kids running down the street, no laughter, just the occasional hum of a car passing by, or a door closing in the distance. Yvonne shook it off. It was late, she was tired, and she hadn't even had time to get a decent meal. She decided to call it a night, tucking Ben into his new room. The room was simple, light blue walls, a small bed with a dinosaur comforter, and a window that overlooked the front yard. Ben crawled into bed, clutching his stuffed bear. "You good?" Yvonne asked, adjusting his blanket. Ben nodded but said nothing. She leaned down to kiss him good night, but before she could pull away, he gripped her hand with surprising force. "Don't leave," he whispered, his voice shaky. Yvonne frowned. "It's okay, honey. I'm just in the next room if you need me." "I don't like it," he mumbled, his eyes darting around the room. "Ben, it's just your imagination. You're fine." But she couldn't shake the unease that prickled at her own skin. She gave him one last smile before closing the door and heading to her own room. That night, she tried to push the strange feeling to the back of her mind and sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. And as the darkness crept in, Something in the house seemed to come alive. On their first night, Ben wakes up screaming, claiming a woman was standing at the foot of his bed. Yvonne dismisses it as a nightmare. Small, unsettling events begin to occur. Doors left ajar, faint whispers, a strange smell in Ben's room. The night was quieter than Yvonne expected, too quiet. She lay in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan above her. The house made occasional creaks and groans, just the sound of a place settling, she told herself. It was nothing unusual. Still, there was an odd heaviness in the air, a sense of being observed, though she dismissed it as the exhaustion of moving day. In the next room, Ben was tucked into his new bed, his favorite stuffed dinosaur beside him. Yvonne had kissed his forehead and left the nightlight on, hoping it would calm his nerves. As she stared at the ceiling, she let out a slow breath, telling herself that tomorrow would feel better. It had to. Then it happened. A blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness of the night. Yvonne shot out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She barely registered her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor as she raced down the hallway to Ben's room. The sound of his panicked cries filled her ears, sharp and desperate, the kind that pierced through a mother's heart. She burst through the door, flipping on the light. Ben was sitting up in bed, his small body trembling, his face pale and wet with tears. "Ben, what happened?" Yvonne rushed to his side, scooping him into her arms. His body was stiff with fear, his hands clutching her with a strength she didn't know he had. "She was here, Mom," he choked out between sobs. "She was standing right there." "Who?" Yvonne asked, trying to keep her voice calm, despite the icy grip of fear creeping up her spine. "Ben, who are you talking about?" "The lady," Ben wailed, pointing a shaking finger toward the foot of his bed. "She was just standing there, watching me." Yvonne's heart raced as she turned to look where he was pointing. The space was empty, nothing but the faint glow of the nightlight casting harmless shadows on the walls. She held him tighter, her own nerves fraying at the edges. "Sweetheart, there's no one here," she said, stroking his hair. "You must have had a bad dream." Ben shook his head fiercely. "No, it wasn't a dream. She was here. She had long hair, and she was cold, Mom. I could feel it." Yvonne hesitated. She glanced around the room again, her logical mind battling her instinct to believe her son. The window was shut, locked from the inside. The door was still ajar from when she'd left it earlier. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. "Ben, I promise you there's no one here," she said gently. "You're safe. It was just your imagination playing tricks on you. Moving to a new house can feel scary sometimes." But Ben wasn't convinced. He buried his face in her chest, his small hands clutching her shirt. "She's real, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's real." Yvonne didn't know what to say. She stayed with him until his sobs quieted and his breathing evened out. He fell asleep in her arms, his grip on her never loosening. She carefully laid him back down, tucking the blanket around him, and sat by his bedside for the rest of the night, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over her. The next morning, Yvonne chalked up the incident to nerves. It was a new house, after all, and Ben had always been a little more sensitive than most kids his age. But something about the way he had described the woman, the conviction in his voice, lingered in her mind. As the day wore on, small things began to bother her. The first was the smell. It wasn't overpowering, but it was distinct, a faint, musty odor that seemed to come from Ben's room. She searched the space thoroughly, sniffing the air near the vents, under the bed, and even in the closet, but she couldn't find the source. The smell came and went, unpredictable and unsettling. Then there was the door. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Yvonne noticed Ben's bedroom door swinging slightly, as if nudged by an invisible hand. The windows were shut tight, and there was no breeze to speak of. She closed it firmly, shaking her head. "Old house quirks," she muttered to herself. But deep down, the excuse didn't sit well. Later that night, as she was folding laundry, she heard it. Faint whispers. At first, she thought it was Ben talking to himself in his room. She walked over to check, but when she peeked inside, he was asleep. His stuffed dinosaur clutched tightly in his arms. The whispers continued, though. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Yvonne, get a grip," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. But the whispers stayed with her, lingering in her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't shake. The second night was worse. Yvonne had just begun to drift off to sleep when Ben's screams jolted her awake once again. She rushed to his room, her heart pounding, only to find him standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide with terror. "She was here again," he cried. "She touched me, Mum. I could feel her hand on my arm." Yvonne's stomach twisted. She looked around the room, the shadows seeming darker than before. Her logical mind told her this was just a nightmare, but the fear in Ben's eyes was unmistakable. "Ben, honey, it's okay. You're safe," she said, pulling him into her arms. "I'm here." "She said something this time," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Yvonne froze. "What did she say?" She said, "She's waiting." Yvonne's blood ran cold. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to comfort him. She stayed with him until he fell asleep, her mind racing with unanswered questions. That night, Yvonne sat in her room, wide awake, staring at the door. She couldn't explain what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right with this house. The next morning, Yvonne sipped her coffee at the kitchen table, her thoughts swirling like the steam rising from her cup. Ben sat across from her, stirring his cereal absent-mindedly, his eyes hollow from another restless night. He hadn't said much since waking up, but the dark circles under his eyes spoke volumes. She'd hoped a new home would mean peace and a chance to rebuild their lives, but the past 2 nights had unraveled her confidence. Something wasn't right. As Yvonne watched Ben pick at his breakfast, a wave of guilt washed over her. Was she dismissing her son's fears too easily? She wanted to believe it was just his imagination, a reaction to stress, to the unfamiliarity of a new environment, but deep down, a gnawing doubt had begun to take root. "I think we should do something fun today," she said, forcing a smile. "How about we go to the park after school, maybe get some ice cream?" Ben didn't respond right away. He looked up at her with weary eyes and asked softly, "What if she's here when we get back?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Yvonne reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Ben, there's no one here, I promise. You're safe with me." But even as she said the words, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. Was he safe? Was she? Later that day, after dropping Ben off at school, Yvonne decided to take action. She started with the basics. She walked through the house, checking every lock, every window, every corner. The locks were secure, the windows shut tight. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the unease lingered. Wait, if you are still with me in this moving story, then you are a genius. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and turn on your notification bell for more stories like this one. Let's continue. She called the landlord next. Roger had seemed so friendly when they'd signed the lease, but his tone turned hesitant when she mentioned the strange occurrences. "Ms. Walker, I can assure you the house is perfectly safe," Roger said. "It's just an older property. Old houses creak, they settle. It's nothing to worry about." "Ben keeps waking up screaming," Yvonne pressed. "He says a woman is in his room. Do you know anything about the previous tenants? Did anything unusual happen here?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to make Yvonne's heart sink. "Well," Roger said slowly, "the man who lived there before you, he passed away. But it was natural causes, nothing sinister. He was elderly." "What about before him?" she asked, her grip tightening on the phone. "I don't really know. I've only owned the property for a few years." Yvonne thanked him and hung up, her frustration mounting. She couldn't shake the feeling that Raja wasn't telling her everything. Determined to dig deeper, Yvonne decided to approach her neighbors. Most of them had waved politely when she moved in, but one man had stood out. Literally. She'd noticed him staring at her from his front porch, a cold, calculating gaze that made her skin crawl. She approached his house cautiously, her hands clutching her jacket as the autumn wind bit at her skin. The man was out in his yard, raking leaves into neat piles. He looked up as she neared, his eyes narrowing. "Hi," Yvonne said, forcing a friendly tone. "I'm Yvonne from across the street. I thought I'd come by and introduce myself." The man didn't smile. He leaned on his rake, his expression unreadable. "Harold," he said curtly, "what can I do for you?" "I was wondering if you knew much about the house I'm renting," Yvonne said. "We've been having strange things happen, and I thought maybe you might know something about its history." Harold's lips twitched into what might have been a smirk. "Strange things, huh?" He glanced past her, toward her house, before his eyes flicked back to hers. "That place has a reputation, you know." Yvonne's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Harold shrugged, his gaze unwavering. "People don't stay long. Always some excuse. Too noisy, too drafty. But you can see it in their eyes. They're scared. Of what? I can't say." Yvonne felt a chill run down her spine. Did anyone ever say why?" Harold's smirk grew colder. "Let's just say the house has a history. You should have done your homework before moving in." "Thanks for your help," Yvonne said stiffly, turning to leave. As she walked away, Harold called after her. "Good luck. You're gonna need it." That night, as she tucked Ben into bed, Yvonne couldn't shake Harold's words. The house has a history. She sat by Ben's side, stroking his hair as he drifted off to sleep. His breathing slowed, his small body relaxing for the first time in days. She watched him, her heart aching with the weight of her own doubts. She had to do something. The next day, she made an appointment with a child psychologist. If nothing else, it might help Ben process his fears, but when she explained the situation during the initial consultation, the psychologist's polite smile faltered. "Children are incredibly intuitive," the psychologist said. "They pick up on things adults might overlook. It could be stress, or it could be—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Well, sometimes children perceive things we can't explain. Whatever the case, the most important thing is to validate Ben's feelings. Let him know you believe him, even if you're unsure yourself." Yvonne nodded, feeling both reassured and unsettled. Was this just stress? Or was there something darker lurking in her home? As Yvonne left the psychologist's office, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Ben's teacher. "Ben isn't feeling well. He says he's scared to go home." Yvonne stared at the message, her heart sinking. Something had to give. She couldn't ignore it any longer, whether it was real or imagined. Whatever was haunting Ben was tearing them both apart. She made a silent promise to herself she would protect her son no matter what. That evening, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual. Yvonne couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but the atmosphere seemed charged with a tension she couldn't ignore. Ben sat curled up on the couch, his stuffed dinosaur clutched tightly to his chest. His eyes darted to the dark corners of the room, his little body tense as if he were bracing for something to happen. "Tell me about her," Yvonne said gently, breaking the silence. Ben hesitated, his small fingers fidgeting with the frayed ear of his toy. "She's tall," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Her hair is long, but it's messy, like she doesn't brush it. She wears a dress, an old one, like from a long time ago. It's dirty." Yvonne felt a chill creep up her spine. What does her face look like? Ben's eyes widened and he shook his head quickly. "She doesn't have one," he said, his voice trembling. "I mean, it's there, but it doesn't move. She doesn't blink. She just looks." Yvonne forced herself to stay calm, even as her heart raced. Has she ever said anything to you? Ben nodded slowly. She whispers. I can't always hear her, but sometimes she says my name. Sometimes she says she's waiting. Waiting for what? Yvonne asked, her voice barely steady. Ben's gaze dropped to the floor. I don't know. That night, Yvonne tucked Ben into bed, her nerves fraying at the edges. I'll leave the door open a little, okay? She said, smoothing his blanket. And if you need me, I'll be right here. Ben nodded, his eyes darting to the corner of the room before landing back on her. Don't leave for too long, he whispered. She kissed his forehead and stepped out, leaving the door ajar. But instead of going to her own room, Yvonne lingered in the hallway, just out of sight. She told herself it was to reassure Ben, but the truth was, she didn't feel comfortable leaving him alone. The minutes dragged by. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside. Yvonne leaned against the wall, her ears straining for any sound from Ben's room. And then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't Ben's voice. It was softer, higher-pitched, and completely unfamiliar. Peeking through the crack, her heart pounded as she crept closer to his door, staring at a strange-looking astronomical object. Peeking through the crack, she could see Ben sitting up in bed, staring at something. It wasn't Ben's voice. She followed his gaze to the window, and her breath caught in her throat. Careful not to make a sound, barely illuminated by the pale glow of the streetlight, was a shadow. It was tall and slender, its shape distorted, as if it didn't quite belong. Yvonne blinked, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light, but the shadow moved. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted closer to the glass, the faint outline of what could only be described as a face pressing against the window. Yvonne's hand shot to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run in and grab Ben, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before it vanished, melting into the darkness, as if it had never been there. She burst into the room, her hands trembling as she scooped Ben into her arms. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. Ben nodded, his face pale. "Did you see her?" he whispered. Yvonne didn't answer. She couldn't. She held him close, her mind racing with questions she didn't want to ask. Yvonne didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room, the curtains drawn tightly shut, her body rigid with tension. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The shadow, the face, the way it had moved. It couldn't have been real. Shadows didn't act like that. People didn't act like that. But it was real. She'd seen it. The next morning, Yvonne made a decision. This wasn't just Ben's imagination, and it wasn't something she could ignore any longer. Whatever was happening in this house, it was beyond her understanding. And for the first time since moving in, Yvonne felt genuinely afraid, not just for herself, but for her son. She glanced at Ben, who was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, his cereal untouched. He looked so small, so vulnerable. Yvonne clenched her fists. Whatever was happening, she was going to find out the truth. The morning after Yvonne saw the shadow, she decided she couldn't rely on her instincts alone anymore. She needed proof. Something tangible, something to convince herself she wasn't losing her mind. The events of the last few nights were too vivid, too real to ignore. But who would believe her? Her hands trembled as she typed "home security systems" into her laptop. By that afternoon, Yvonne had purchased and installed a small set of motion-activated security cameras. She placed one in the living room, one in the hallway outside Ben's room, and, with a pang of guilt, one inside Ben's bedroom. She told herself it was for his safety, but the unease she felt at invading his privacy was overshadowed by the desperate need to know what was happening. "Sweetheart, I'm setting these up to keep us safe," Yvonne explained to Ben, as she adjusted the angle of the camera in his room. "It's just so we can make sure there's nothing to worry about." Bill nodded, his small face serious. "If you see her, will you make her go away?" Yvonne swallowed the lump in her throat. Yes, Ben, I'll do everything I can. That night, Yvonne lay in bed, staring at her phone, the app for the security cameras open and ready. Her heart raced as she watched the live feed from Ben's room. The dim glow of his nightlight bathed the room in soft golden light. He was fast asleep, his small body curled under the covers. For the first hour there was nothing but stillness, the kind that felt almost oppressive. But then, just past midnight, the motion alert pinged on her phone. Her pulse quickened as she tapped the notification. The screen showed Ben's room. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Ben was still asleep, the room unchanged. But then she noticed it. Movement in the corner, near the closet. At first it was subtle, like a shadow shifting against the wall, but as she squinted at the screen, the shadow began to take form. It was faint but unmistakable, the outline of a figure, tall and unnaturally thin. It didn't move like a person, it swayed, almost fluidly, as if it were floating. Yvonne's breath hitched as the figure seemed to lean over Ben, its head tilting unnaturally, as though studying him. Then, the window. On the feed, she could see it inching open, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The curtains fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. Yvonne's phone slipped from her hands as she bolted to Ben's room, her heart hammering in her chest. She threw open the door, flipping on the light. Ben stirred but didn't wake, his face peaceful. The window was slightly ajar, the latch undone. Her stomach churned as she rushed to shut it, locking it tightly. The room was empty, but the memory of the figure loomed like a shadow over her. The next morning, Yvonne tried to hide her fear from Ben, but he could sense it. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. She was about to suggest they leave the house for the day when Ben suddenly looked up. "She left something," he said quietly. Yvonne froze. "What do you mean?" Ben pointed to the small space under his bed. "It's there. She left it for." Her hands trembled as she crouched down, lifting the blanket to peer beneath the bed. At first, she saw nothing but dust and the scattered pieces of a toy car. But then, tucked against the far corner, was a small object. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. When she pulled it out, her breath caught. It was an old, tarnished bracelet, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique store. The clasp was broken, and the silver was dull with age. But what made Yvonne's skin crawl was the charm hanging from it, a tiny locket in the shape of a heart. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a faded black and white photo of a woman. Her expression was blank, her eyes empty. Yvonne dropped the bracelet as if it burned her. "Mom," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "That's her. That's the lady." Yvonne didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaky but firm as she explained the situation. "There's been someone in my house," she said, clutching Ben protectively. "I need someone here now." When the police arrived, Yvonne felt a mix of relief and dread. 2 officers entered the house, their calm professionalism contrasting sharply with the chaos swirling in her mind. She led them to Ben's room, showing them the bracelet and the footage from the security camera. The younger officer frowned as he watched the video, his eyes narrowing at the shadowy figure. "It's faint, but it's there," he said. "Could be someone outside casting a shadow through the window, but the movement is odd." The older officer examined the bracelet. "This doesn't belong to either of you." "No," Yvonne said firmly, "and it wasn't here when we moved in." Ben tugged on her sleeve. "Tell them about the window." Yvonne nodded. "The window was locked when I put him to bed, but when I came in last night it was open. Someone was here." The officers exchanged a look. "We'll need to file a report and send this bracelet for analysis," the older officer said. "In the meantime, we recommend staying somewhere else for a few nights, just to be safe." Yvonne hesitated. "You think we're in danger?" We can't say for sure, but until we figure out what's going on, it's better to be cautious, the younger officer said. Yvonne's mind raced. She couldn't deny the relief she felt at the thought of leaving the house, but she also felt an obligation to protect it, to protect Ben from whatever had invaded their space. As the officers left, promising to follow up, Yvonne made a decision. This wasn't over. The footage, the bracelet, the whispers. It was all connected. Whatever was happening in her home, Yvonne was determined to get to the bottom of it. But as she stared out the window that night, clutching Ben close, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The neighbor's secret. The following morning, Yvonne woke to the sound of a knock at her door. She hadn't slept at all, her thoughts consumed by the events of the past few nights. Ben was still asleep in her bed, clutching his stuffed dinosaur tightly. She hurried to the door, opening it to find one of the officers from the night before. "Miss Walker," the officer said, his face serious, "we've been looking into your case. Do you have a moment to talk?" Yvonne nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Did you find anything?" The officer hesitated. "We ran the bracelet you gave us through our system. It doesn't match any recent missing persons cases, but we did find something unusual. The photo inside the locket, it matches an old file we have on a woman who lived in your house about 30 years ago. Her name was Margaret Hensley." Yvonne felt a chill creep up her spine. "What happened to her?" "She passed away," the officer said, his tone cautious. "It was ruled a natural death, but there were complications. She was a recluse, rarely seen outside her home, and neighbors reported strange behavior before she died. Some claimed she believed someone was watching her." The room seemed to grow colder. "And the bracelet?" Yvonne asked. "How did it get here?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," the officer replied. "But there's one more thing. Your neighbor, Harold Baker, used to work as a caretaker. He's listed as Margaret Hensley's caretaker in the months leading up to her death." Yvonne's knees felt weak as the pieces began to fall into place. Harold Baker, the cold, distant man who had warned her about the house's history, had been connected to the previous occupant. The officer's voice cut through her thoughts. "We're going to have a chat with Mr. Baker," he said. "Do you mind if we look around his property? It might help us understand what's going on." Yvonne nodded, her heart pounding. As the officers crossed the street, she watched from the window, her anxiety mounting with every step they took. Harold opened the door before they even knocked, his expression a mix of irritation and apprehension. "What's this about?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the street. The officer spoke to him calmly, but Yvonne couldn't hear what they were saying. She saw Harold's face shift, first defensive, then nervous. He stepped aside, allowing them into his home. Minutes felt like hours as Yvonne waited, her mind racing. Finally, one of the officers emerged, his expression grim. He motioned for her to come over. Yvonne hesitated but felt a surge of determination. She couldn't run from this. She had to know the truth. Inside Harold's house, the air felt thick and oppressive. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in dim, artificial light. The walls were lined with faded photographs and shelves cluttered with old knickknacks. But it wasn't the decor that made Yvonne's stomach turn. On the dining table sat a collection of items, a journal, several small trinkets, and more bracelets, each tarnished and bearing eerie similarities to the one found in Ben's room. "This is what we found," the officer said. "It seems Mr. Baker has been keeping these mementos." Yvonne's eyes widened as she scanned the objects. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harold, now seated with his hands cuffed, glared at her. "It's not what it looks like," he snapped. "Then what is it?" Yvonne demanded, her fear quickly turning to anger. "Why do you have these things?" The older officer stepped forward. "Mr. Baker claims these belonged to Margaret Hensley. He says he kept them as reminders of his time caring for her. But some of these objects were reported missing by previous tenants of your home." Yvonne's breath caught. So he's been inside my house? The officer nodded grimly. Oh, it's likely. We're still piecing it together. But the evidence suggests he's been using his connection to the property to, revisit it over the years. We believe he's been entering the house without permission. Yvonne felt her stomach churn. And the figure in Ben's room? The woman he keeps seeing? The officers exchanged a glance. That's harder to explain, the younger officer admitted. Harold denies any involvement with what your son has described, but the history of the house, combined with his behavior, it's possible Margaret's presence is more than just a memory, the older officer said, his tone careful but unsettling. As the officers escorted Harold out of the house, a crowd of neighbors began to gather, their whispers growing louder as the scene unfolded. Harold's icy demeanor cracked as he was placed in the back of the squad car. You should have left that house alone, he snarled at Yvonne, his voice dripping with venom. Some things don't stay buried. Yvonne stood frozen on the sidewalk, her heart pounding as the police car drove away. The weight of Harold's words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. That night, Yvonne sat with Ben on the couch, the bracelet and its haunting locket resting on the coffee table. The house felt quieter, as though the tension that had hung over it had finally lifted. But Yvonne couldn't shake the unease that Harold's arrest hadn't solved everything. Do you think she's gone? Ben asked, his voice small. Yvonne hesitated, pulling him closer. I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise, you're safe now. As the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences in the house stopped. The whispers, the shadows, the unsettling sense of being watched, all of it seemed to vanish with Harold's departure. But, every now and then, late at night, Yvonne would catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, or hear a faint creak in the silence. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling. But deep down, she wondered if Margaret Hensley was still there, bound to the place where she had spent her final days. Perhaps her presence wasn't malevolent after all, just a lingering echo of a life interrupted. And as Yvonne kissed Ben goodnight, she couldn't help but glance at the corner of his room, half expecting to see a shadow that wasn't her own. The story of the house and the woman in the shadows wasn't over. It had simply shifted, becoming a part of Yvonne's and Ben's lives. And while they had found a way to move forward, the question lingered, unspoken. Was Margaret watching over them? Or was she still waiting for something, or someone, they couldn't yet understand? The house was quiet. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt like peace rather than dread. Yvonne sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, her eyes wandering to the security monitor on her phone. The cameras had shown nothing unusual for days now. No shadows, no movement, no unexplained openings of doors or windows. It felt almost surreal after everything they had been through. Ben sat across from her, coloring a picture of a dinosaur with green and blue crayons. His face, once pale and etched with fear, now looked more like the vibrant boy she remembered. Yvonne watched him, a pang of guilt twisting in her chest. She had doubted him, dismissed his fears as nightmares or imagination, and yet he had been right all along. Ben, she said softly, setting her mug down, I need to tell you something. Ben looked up, his crayon pausing mid-stroke. What, Mum? Yvonne leaned forward, her hands clasped together. I'm sorry. I didn't believe you when you said she was real. I thought I was protecting you by saying it was just your imagination, but I wasn't listening to you. I should have listened. Ben stared at her for a moment, his big, expressive eyes searching her face. Then he nodded, his small hand reaching across the table to squeeze hers. It's okay, he said simply. She's gone now, right? Yvonne smiled, her throat tightening. Yes, sweetheart, she's gone, and I'll make sure she doesn't come back. The days that followed were focused on reclaiming their home. Yvonne scrubbed every inch of the house, throwing open the windows to let in fresh air and sunlight. She rearranged furniture, painted the walls in bright, warm colors, and even hung up some of Ben's artwork in the hallway. "This is our house," she told him one afternoon as they worked together to plant flowers in the front yard. "Not hers, not anyone else's, ours." Ben nodded solemnly, planting a marigold with care. "Do you think she was sad?" he asked suddenly. Yvonne paused, her hands deep in the soil. "Sad?" Ben nodded. "The lady. I think maybe she just wanted someone to see her." Yvonne swallowed hard, struck by the profound simplicity of his words. "Maybe she was, Ben. But she doesn't belong here anymore. It's our home now." Ben smiled, his first genuine smile in what felt like forever. "Oh, good." The neighborhood had begun to shift too. Harold Baker's arrest had sent ripples through the community. Neighbors who had once seemed distant now stopped by to check on Yvonne and Ben, offering kind words and small gestures of support. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start. Yvonne felt the weight of isolation lifting, replaced by a cautious optimism. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Yvonne and Ben sat on the porch swing together, the warm breeze carrying the scent of the newly planted flowers. Ben leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder. "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" he asked. Yvonne thought for a moment, her arm wrapping around him protectively. "I don't know about forever," she said with a smile, "but for now, I think this is where we're meant to be." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Yvonne felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The house had been a place of fear, of darkness, but now it felt like it could be a home, a real home, filled with love and light. Whatever had haunted them before was gone, and in its place was a stronger bond between mother and son. Yvonne knew the scars of their experience would remain, but they would also serve as reminders to trust, to listen, and to never dismiss the fears of the ones she loved. And as Ben drifted off to sleep that night, safe and sound in his room, Yvonne stood in the doorway, watching over him. For the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. Whatever shadows had lingered before, they no longer had a place in her home. This was their house now, their sanctuary, and it would be for as long as they chose to make it so.